English literature, a treasure of Western civilization. As part of our English literature workshop today, we're wanting to look at a study of the great classics of English literature. It's absolutely essential for true education to know the classics of our literature. The English classics have played a key role in teaching individual virtue and for laying foundations for Western civilization. Reading the works of William Shakespeare or John Milton, Jane Austen, and Charles Dickens helps us exercise our minds and enrich our experiences. Christian literature enables us to recognize truths and appreciate beauty and admire what is virtuous. The literary classics include drama that purges our minds with breathtaking intensity and heartbreaking pathos, and poetry that makes us hunger and thirst after virtue and courage. Good literature enables us to recognize what is truly beautiful and honorable. It also helps shape our character by teaching us to despise what is dishonorable, to love what is noble, and to aspire to live higher standards in our own lives. In his 1950 Nobel Literature Award acceptance speech, William Faulkner described the primary duty of authors to remind men of the courage and honor and hope and pride and compassion and pity and sacrifice which have been the glory of our past. The study of great works of literature have always been considered foundational in education. Well, always until recently, that is. Unfortunately, like every other aspect of Western civilization, English literature, and doubtless literature of any other country today too, is under relentless assault. In too many universities, English professors seem to be teaching almost anything and everything but classic English literature. Many who have enrolled in English classes at universities have found themselves studying Marxist political and economic theory, investigation of pornography through the ages. That is not a joke. That's put under English literature. The gender theories of Freud, Latin culture. I would have thought that's something you study under Latin culture, but English literature is a cover for all kinds of evils. Feminist theories, deconstructionism, lesbianism, misogyny, and tirades against racism, sexism, colonialism, homophobia, and a bewildering array of other postmodern radical political agendas like transphobia, interphobia, biphobia. If you've ever heard of those things before, you'll hear about it in English literature up on a hill at UCT. Now, this is the kind of irony they don't seem to see. Here's Amazon selling, there are more than 2 gender t-shirts. Choose yours, do you want the male or the female fit? And yeah, there are more than 2 genders, but they've only got them available in 2 genders. This has led to an increasing public demand for shallow, superficial, sensational, vile, violent, debased, and disgusting content, which unfortunately is often being palmed off as literature today. Never judge a book by its movie. There's some great books which have got some outrageous, pathetic, and puerile films that have come out using the same title and wrecking the content. We could be living in the dumbest generation in history, as seen by the fact that family conversation at the meal table is being undermined by people with their blasted, cursed, damned cell phones. A bunch of young people together who've got nothing to say to one another unless they're texting it to them. Imagine sitting in an art gallery and being distracted by one's blasted, cursed, damned cell phones. Albert Einstein says, I fear the day that technology will surpass our human interaction, the world will have a generation of idiots. Well, we could be right there right now. The amount of times you see, I've had people coming to one of our camps, sitting in our library downstairs in the boardroom on their cell phone, surrounded by great books. And the best thing a person can do is scroll through their cell phone. I've often thought, are they coming to the right camp? Do they have any idea where they're coming to? This is not what a BWS is standing for. And here you've got people completely and utterly distracted by these silly little hand devices. Many politically correct professors in the English departments so despise and fear Western civilization that those enrolling to learn more of English literature are more likely to find themselves assaulted with bankrupt ideologies than to be exposed to some of the greatest literature in Western civilization. And that would be particularly true on Sodom and Gomorrah on the hillside here in Cape Town, University of Cape Town. Instead of subjecting oneself to anti-Christian indoctrination in these so-called English departments of secular universities, students would immeasurably enrich their experience and their education by going directly to the works of Charles Dickens and Jane Austen, John Milton, William Shakespeare, John Bunyan, William Wordsworth, Evelyn Waugh, William Blake, Geoffrey Chaucer, Thomas Mallory, George Orwell, C.S. Lewis, and other greats of English literature. They'll learn a lot more from the books than they ever could from the English departments of the average university today. English literature teaches you appreciation for military valor, for chastity and integrity, self-criticism, and for the Christian faith, all of which are at the heart of English literature. In fact, if you want a stepping stone to education, War and Peace by Tolstoy, The Scarlet Letter, Great Expectations, Wuthering Heights, Little Women, Sense and Sensibility, Jane Eyre, Pride and Prejudice, Oliver Twist, those are good stepping stones to a good education. But you're not going to get that in the average English department in the average university today. Beauty and ugliness in our characters are exposed in classic literature, along with the capacities for good and evil of the human mind and of our heart. Skill is admired and achievement is extolled, and the disastrous consequence of laziness and cowardice and foolish choices are exposed. You can't beat good classic English literature for doing that. There are an infinite variety of wonderful, life-transforming lessons that are to be learned from classic English literature. Take William Shakespeare. William Shakespeare's plays have universal appeal because of his intuitive understanding of human nature. Shakespeare's plays reflect the world as it is. Shakespeare evidences a comprehensive, accurate, and deep perception of the nature of things, particularly understands human nature. Shakespeare's plays are delightful, breathtaking, real, and natural, and he gives us characters who show us more about what human beings really are. When you see a Shakespearean play, you recognize the characters. You know them from your own experience. You've met people like this. Through all those insights enable us to understand these characters better than we ever did before. Hamlet is so much more than a depressed and confused young man. He is self-conscious and he's sensitive to his moral failings and the moral failings of his elders. He's keenly aware of the implications of everyone's actions. But tragically, he's unwilling to shoulder the responsibility and to gain control over events. Hamlet was one of our separate books when I was studying at school in Rhodesia, and we had real classics to study, unlike what they're giving these kids today. Now, Richard III, and by Richard III I mean Shakespeare's play, not the real historical character, because sadly Shakespeare did go into character assassination of Richard III, who historically was not as bad a person as he is in the play, but despite the fact he is being a propagandist for the Tudors, who were the rival kings who supplanted his line, Richard III in the play is a wicked king who resents other people's happiness. He plots to ruin them for his own advantage. He's an outrageous villain. His schemes succeed for a time, but then they unravel completely. A horse, my kingdom for a horse. Shakespeare's plays enable us to understand human nature and human history and the things that human beings think about in a clearer way than any other playwright has succeeded in doing before or since. Shakespeare's characters look at things from many different angles. They don't merely consider issues, they define the issues. His plays are full of famous speeches which focus on the heart of an issue. Each play seems to explore a major issue. So, for example, Hamlet considers death from every angle. Why we long for death, why we fear death, what does it do to our bodies, what does it do to our souls? What do we know about death? So much is actually a mystery. There are many ways that there are to die, and there are many reasons for dying. And there are sword fights in the play, and there's all kinds of poisonings, and there's a girl who goes insane and kills herself. There's a rash young man who throws away his life in a duel over his sister's honor. There's a scheming courtier who's killed as he eavesdrops. Can be very fatal to hide behind a curtain or a carpet in order to eavesdrop. And there's college friends who betray their schoolmates and conspire to kill him, only to fall into their own trap, drink their own poison. A fratricide, that's a person who killed his father, who's racked by guilt, but he cannot give himself to give up his brother's wife and his brother's kingdom that he stole. Hamlet's famous to be or not to be speech, and numerous poisonings, both the purposeful poisonings and the accidental poisonings, are also included in this extraordinary play. Henry V considers every aspect of kingship and success. Small time, but in that small most greatly lived the star of England, fortune made her sword, by which the world's best garden he achieved. What is a king? What are the qualities that make for greatness? What parts generosity, courage, leadership, and humility are required in a king? How many parts ruthlessness? What are the costs of being a king? but even the heaviest costs are worth these great achievements. In The Merchant of Venice, Shakespeare considers wealth. Every person incident in the play seems to have something to do with money. There's Antonio, a merchant who's grown rich by risky ventures in the trade. There's Shylock, a Jew who lives by lending money at interest and hoards coins and jewels at home. There's Shylock's daughter, who elopes, taking large amounts of his wealth with her and wastes it like a prodigal. There are two marriages which are made at least partly for money. Portia, an heiress whose father's will specifies she must be awarded to the man who guesses rightly amongst 3 treasure chests. What kind of criteria is that? Bassanio, a charming young man with large debts, promising, handsome, spendthrift, disingenuous, careless. He dares to ask his friend, from whom he's already borrowed money that he cannot pay back, for a large and very risky loan. There's a lawsuit over a defaulted loan in which the moneylender claims the right to cut a pound of flesh from a merchant's chest. The play includes much poetry concerning wealth and treasure. Where does wealth come from? Where does it go? What does it mean to men? What does it mean to women? What does it mean to their relationships? Such themes are the bones and the muscles underneath the surface of the drama in the Shakespearean plays. Shakespeare was an expert in the common fundamental laws of human nature, and he plainly drew his plays from the actual structure of human experience. Shakespeare's plays prod and poke at reality. He throws characters, events, and ideas together and makes them combine in every possible way. He shows how ambition tends to work differently in men and women. He exposed the ugliness of human greed and lust and violence and envy and betrayal. Although today these sort of things are glamorized and popularized in many movies and plays, but in Shakespeare's plays these are exposed and are exposed as the ugly things they are. Macbeth exposes what unbridled selfish ambition can do to human beings. Macbeth becomes progressively more paranoid and isolated as a murderer. Lady Macbeth, who's all strength and resolve and confidence when she's provoking her husband Macbeth to commit the initial murder, she cracks under the weight of the responsibility and guilt once the deed is done. The tyrant's crimes set in motion destructive forces that will ultimately overwhelm him or her. Othello is focused on lust and jealousy. Othello's ensign, Lago, envious of Othello's lieutenant Cassio, deceives Othello into murdering his faithful wife, Desdemona, by persuading Othello that she has been unfaithful with Cassio, which is not true. The play revolves around the nature and effects of jealousy, the green-eyed monster which doth consume the meat it feeds on. It's also seen as a clear warning against marrying temperamental men of other races, and was seen as that for many years. King Lear is a profound play set in remote past of pre-Christian Britain. King Lear abdicates his kingdom in favor of his 2 daughters, Goneril and Regan, who feed his appetite for affection with extravagant, insincere speeches. When they turn on him and reduce the former king to being a homeless wanderer in the wind and the rain, he finds support from his 3rd daughter, Cordelia, whom he had disinherited because of her failure to flatter, like her treacherous sisters, but she proved to be the one who is truly faithful to her father. The tragedy of King Lear centers on being deceived by insincerity and the failure of the most basic natural relationship between parents and child. Honoring our parents is absolutely basic and natural and one of God's commands, but it was violated by the 2 older sisters here in this play of King Lear. William Shakespeare lived through tumultuous times, and here's some of the historical context of the different plays, and his plays are unread as he produced them. And then this is a more geographic setting of where the different plays of Shakespeare are set. Of course, some are set in England, like Macbeth in Scotland and Richard III in England, and Richard II, and As You Like It, Henry IV, Henry VIII, whereas you can see that obviously Hamlet's set in Denmark, and Othello set in what today is called Turkey, what used to be the Byzantine Empire, and Antony and Cleopatra is set in Egypt, and Much Ado About Nothing, North Africa, and you can see the different ones, Romeo and Juliet set in Italy and so on. So geographically, he covers a lot of the world, even as he covers a lot of different history. Shakespeare's tragedies show that some choices are inherently destructive. It's no wonder Shakespeare is so shunned and slandered by liberal professors, because they don't like the idea that our choices have anything to do with it. we're all victims of our class or race or gender or something like that. They don't like the idea that there's personal responsibility for personal choices. Shakespeare repeatedly exposed the wickedness of fornication and adultery, the importance of premarital virginity, the shame of unfaithfulness, and the foundational importance of Christian marriage and obeying the laws of God. No wonder Shakespeare is hated by English literature professors. If you go to Westminster Abbey, as I've gone, you can see a poet's corner where Shakespeare's got a pride of place, and England honours its poets. I don't know how many countries honour their poets in such a way. Although it's striking when you go to Westminster Abbey, premier place is given to David Livingstone, right set in the front. Everyone entering Westminster Abbey has to pass David Livingstone's tomb. That's the first thing in the first tomb in Westminster Abbey, pride of place. But the Poets' Corner is an honourable section. Now, I don't know how many people recognise that the Lion King film is completely based on Hamlet. You've got this prince of a king who is murdered by his brother, and then he's got to go into exile, and everything runs well under the king, in this case the lion, but the moment the hyenas take over, the whole kingdom degenerates, and you can see how socialism works. Hamlet's a good morality play showing how South deteriorated, because as long as the lions were ruling things, things worked well. Now the hyenas are running it, everything falls to pieces, and the whole place goes into disaster area. And how the prince, who tries to run away from his responsibilities, and he tries to be all jovial and irresponsible, is finally forced to face his responsibilities. You've even got the to be or not to be kind of scene, this time an elephant's graveyard instead of a human cemetery. But The Lion King is basically Hamlet set into animal kind of kingdom situation. One of the greatest English poets, John Milton, was a dedicated evangelical Christian. Milton was one of the most learned writers of literature. He studied for 7 years at Cambridge University, and he completed 6 years of postgraduate studies, becoming fluent in Latin, Greek, Hebrew, and Italian. I went to Milton High School in Rhodesia, and so we knew Milton. He knew all the great literature in each of the languages, and he studied philosophy, theology, maths, music, history, and science. He traveled throughout Europe, and he met many of the great minds of his time. During the English Civil War, Milton was leader of the Puritan forces fighting for Parliament. And John Milton served as Secretary for Foreign Tongues under General Oliver Cromwell, including when he became Lord Protector of England. And John Milton wrote Paradise Lost and Paradise Regained. To Milton, the most important events in history were the events of the Bible. The central drama of human history is temptation. The highest form of heroism is patient resistance to temptation. Comus, a play written by Milton, centers around the temptation of the lady, a 15-year-old daughter of an earl. Comus exalts temperance and chastity as essential for our safety and our happiness. We fall by giving in to temptation. We rise by resisting temptation. Despite personal tragedy in his own life, he lost his sight by his mid-40s, and then he was disgraced and impoverished by the restoration of the monarchy under Charles II. Milton epitomized the heroic ideal of patient endurance of affliction and unjust cause. As he wrote, "Who best bear his mild yoke, they best serve him." Now, you can't call what he suffered mild, but he called it mild compared to what Christ suffered for us and compared to eternity. The opening lines of Paradise Lost declares, "Of man's first disobedience and the fruit, of that forbidden tree whose mortal taste brought death into the world and all our woe, with loss of Eden, till one greater man restore us and regain the blissful state." The degrading doom of disobedience is seen in Paradise Lost. Milton's works show how obedience to God can be heroic and liberating. He exposes the ultimate folly of giving into temptation. Giving into temptation is always folly, because temptation is designed to drag us down. Milton shows that disobedience begins by looking so attractive, but it's ultimately selfish, squalid, degrading, defiling, destructive, and it's doomed. Giving into temptation is always the wrong thing to do. Just as in Paradise Lost, where he focused on the fall of Adam and Eve, in Paradise Regained, Milton focused on Christ's victory over temptation in the desert, and his triumph over sin, Satan, death, hell, and the grave. Even when a key leader of the victorious parliamentary forces, John Milton championed the freedom of the press. It's a fact of history freedom of the speech and freedom of the press were not invented by Enlightenment rationalists and secular humanists, but rather by the Puritan Christians, the Calvinist Christians of the English Protectorate. Milton argued for a wide liberty to publish opinions, even erroneous ones. When the Puritan Parliament was triumphant over all its enemies and was the ultimate power in the land, John Milton addressed the members of the House to urge them to decide for free speech in the midst of their victories and successes. To Milton, truth is so important we cannot afford to miss the opportunity to learn from some piece of it which may never see the light of day under the restrictions of government censorship. And anyone who thinks that the work of Reformation is complete is mistaken. He's still very short of the whole truth. Censorship would hinder the work of truth seekers. Semper reformata, Ecclesia reformata reformanda est. The church, having been reformed, must still be reformed more. And so the work of Reformation is never over. We've continually got to reevaluate everything in light of the Bible, get back to the Bible. And so censorship is unchristian. We should not be censors, says Milton. Now, Milton explained it's our duty to sift through different opinions, to test them to find what is right. All opinions, yes, errors, learned, read, and collated, are of main service and assistance towards the speedy attainment of what is truest. So even bad books can be useful to the truth seeker, to the discreet and judicious reader. Milton taught even errors can be used to confute, to forewarn, and to illustrate. So, for example, if you go into a library downstairs, you'll see we've got some bad books. I've got the Mormon, Book of Mormon. I've got the Jehovah's Witness translation of the New Testament. I've got a whole range of things like the Quran, Das Kapital, Marxist Manifesto, the Communist Manifesto of 1848. We've got a lot of bad books because we want to expose them, we want to counter them. So I've got a whole section just on cults, and I've got a whole section on communism and Islam, where we even have primary books on their side. Because we are researchers, we are seeking to fight evil, and you must understand it. When I wanted to learn about Islam, I went to a mosque and I got the Muslim Imam to teach me about Islam. When I wanted to learn about Mormonism, I went to the Mormons. When I went to learn about Jehovah's Witnesses, I went to Jehovah's Witnesses, and I've got their books. And so whatever we're studying, we want to understand from the other side too, so that we can refute and counter it. So we don't want to counter and censor the errors of these false religions. We want to have them judged by the free marketplace of ideas, iron sharpening iron. We live in a world where good and evil grow up together almost inseparably, because God wants human beings to be free. For God sure esteems the growth and completing of one virtuous person more than the restraint of 10 vicious, said John Milton. As a champion of freedom of speech and freedom of religion, freedom of worship, freedom of conscience, freedom of the press, and as an unparalleled poet, John Milton and his epics, Paradise Lost and Paradise Regained, testify against the dangers of societies exiling religious truth from the public marketplace of ideas. And then Jane Austen is widely recognized as one of the greatest Christian English writers of all time. No other writer so often compared with Shakespeare. Jane Austen has been described as the most perfect artist amongst women, and the writer whose books are immortal, the greatest female writer in English. And is she hated by the English literature departments? Despite the fact that Jane Austen spent her whole life financially dependent on her father and her brothers, sharing a room with her sister Cassandra, writing her novels in a general sitting room subject to every kind of interruption in a manse which was busy indeed, Jane Austen was productive, and she was a genius. Her novels present some of the most insightful commentaries on society and the most extraordinary understanding of human nature and human character. It's understandable why the politically correct radicals would want to distort or ignore Jane Austen's literary contributions, because Jane Austen is so obviously a conservative Christian whose novels celebrate marriage and patriarchal society. So she's actually a feminist nightmare. And here's some contemporary portraits from Jane Austen's books. Now, the color, you must remember, was added later. When books were printed in black and white, and they had to have, at that time, the printing industry needed people to hand add the color that was needed in the books. So that just shows you how extraordinary the printing process was. If you had color illustrations like this in a Jane Austen's first edition, it all had to be added by hand. Jane Austen's novels encourage men to take charge. The male tendency is not to take responsibility, to keep their options open, not to get involved. That is what makes young men so dangerous. So Jane Austen doesn't have this, I don't want men to get involved. She wants men to get involved, take responsibility, and do their duty. herself fleeing from the responsibility. Grow up, get a life, get a wife. Don't carry on wasting your time like an endless teenager. The villains in Jane Austen's novels are generally the men who don't stick around. The male tendency to avoid or weasel out of their commitments creates havoc. Desertion from duty leads to disaster. Jane Austen recognized the stubborn realities of male and female psychology. She takes her religion very seriously, and she finds it completely natural that men and women should occupy gender-specific roles. She accepted that human misery is caused not by traditional societal rules and structures, but by individual sin and dereliction of duty, bad personal choices. Flying in the face of the politically correct feminist rhetoric and egalitarian dogma, Jane Austen's novels portray the failure of female self-control on the one hand and male abdication of their responsibilities on the other, as amongst the chief causes of people's unhappiness. Her novels celebrate old-fashioned marriage, in which a woman can be expected to be guided and protected by her husband, and to be responsible for the management of her household and the nurture of her children as the most intense sources of fulfillment. Jane Austen happily pokes fun at every kind of superficiality, pretense, and hypocrisy. Her novels are full of women who are too free with their tongues, such as the embarrassingly vulgar Mrs. Bennet in Pride and Prejudice. Mrs. Bennet's loud gossip about her eldest daughter's success with the rich young man, Bingley, determines that man's friend, Mr. Darcy, to get his friend out of the neighborhood and to break her daughter's heart. It's Mrs. Bennet's fault. She's the one who's boasting about getting this man who's worth £5,000 a year and things like this, and she's just so vulgar and coarse and loud. She's the one who's causing the problems. Numerous female characters' habits of selfish whining makes their families miserable and cause untold suffering. Lydia Bennet in Pride and Prejudice so violates the accepted social customs and good sense, she ends up dependent on her relatives and her friends who need to bribe her seducer to marry her. Lady Catherine de Bourgh in Pride and Prejudice is a rich widow who's clearly spoiled by too much money. Elizabeth found that nothing was beneath this great lady's attention, which could furnish her with an occasion for dictating to others. Emma Woodhouse, although handsome, clever, and rich, and only 21 years old, is spoiled, not only because of money and good looks, but because of her affectionate, indulgent father, is a hypochondriac who does not have the energy to give her the guidance and direction she so clearly needs. Emma is in danger of ending up as some interfering, bossy old dragon like Lady Catherine de Bourgh, as she amuses herself with matchmaking, with disastrous consequences. Because Emma's blessed with more than any young woman could possibly want, more intelligence, more freedom, more money, more good looks, and without the needed constraints from her parents, she's always used to getting her own way, and she mercilessly interferes in people's lives with disastrous consequences. Emma chooses to adopt Harriet Smith as her friend to manipulate, rather than Jane Fairfax, who is of Emma's own class, because Jane is just as intelligent as Emma and much more accomplished. And Jane reminds Emma of her own faults, few though they may be, whereas Harriet gives Emma endless opportunities to indulge herself in condescension and advice and to bask in Harriet's uncritical gratitude. Emma falls to the temptation to enjoy Harriet's blind flattery rather than to make the effort to live up to a real relationship with a girl who is her equal. Laziness and pride almost destroy Emma. Now, there are many spoiled men in Jane Austen's novels too. These men are not the feminist villains of those men who attempt to dominate women. Jane Austen's male villains are those who shirk their responsibilities and do not involve themselves, or they fail to take charge when they should. Mr. Elton humiliates Harriet Smith in public in order to please his vulgar new bride. John Dashwood allows his selfish wife to persuade him to break his promise to his dying father to take care of his sisters. Mr. Bennet in Pride and Prejudice fails to be an effective father. He retreats into his library and to his sardonic sense of humor to escape his ridiculous interfering wife, Mrs. Bennet, and he lets the daughters run wild. Mr. Woodhouse is so weak that it doesn't even occur to him that he has a duty to guide his daughter Emma, who's ruining people's lives. And so Jane Austen's novels are full of brilliant insights into the failings of human beings and what we need to do. Sir Thomas Bertram of Mansfield Park is a strict parent, but he fails to adequately interfere to the extent of teaching his daughters the necessity of self-denial and humility. Most seriously, he allows his daughter Maria to marry a worthless man whom he knows does not love her, just because he's reluctant to scrutinize her motives too closely. Jane Austen exposes the tendency of men to fail to take responsibility. In each of her novels is at least one man who pays a woman the kind of attention that he should not, unless his intentions are serious, meaning courtship and marriage, which in these cases they are not. In Sense and Sensibility, Marianne Dashwood, seriously hurt by her experience of passionate Jean-Jacques Rousseau type naturalism. Jean-Jacques Rousseau was the author and philosopher who prepared the way for the French Revolution, along with Voltaire. Rousseau believed in the goodness of the natural savage. So basically, people walk around naked, eating their neighbors, are more virtuous than civilized Christians in Europe. And Jean-Jacques Rousseau epitomized this by having, I think it was 26 illegitimate children, whom he all abandoned to the poorhouse, did nothing to help them, and they all died before reaching adulthood. And that's Jean-Jacques Rousseau's morality, if you want to call it that way. But Rousseau and Voltaire laid the foundations of the French Revolution. The idea that, it can't be wrong if it feels so right, and all this kind of nonsense of, if it feels good, do it. And Rousseau really is the ideal is a noble savage. He hates civilization and loves savagery. And so she had at one time indulged in passionate Rousseau-type naturalism, and now she found refuge in religious principles, in conventional standards and traditional family values. So Marianne Dashwood marries with no sentiment superior to strong esteem and lively friendship, settling for much less in marriage than she had once hoped for, because she had recognized that she had almost destroyed her life. She had seen where her blindness to cold, hard facts of human nature had almost taken her. She recognized how much worse it could have been if she had followed the Rousseauian naturalism, such as in the case of the already seduced, pregnant, abandoned other girl who was in love with her almost lover. Now, you get a lot of details of location in the Bronte sisters' novels like Wuthering Heights. They describe every room, they decide what people are wearing, they describe the climate. Jane Austen does not do that. You get almost no details about settings and what people are wearing in Jane Austen's novels. Jane Austen focuses on relationships, on people and characters. She's not setting the scene by explaining what the climate was like outside or what the decor was inside the house. But she's focusing on the relationships of people. There are some faithful films that have been produced, like on Pride and Prejudice and Sense and Sensibility. BBC has produced a few faithful films which stick to the book and don't try to innovate and just keep it traditional. Jane Austen says there are people who the more you do for them, the less they will do for themselves. That is not a view that the English professors want you to think today. They want the socialist idea of we are responsible to help people who are not willing to help themselves, and we must do for others what they could do for themselves, which is disastrous, catastrophic, in fact. I like this quote from Jane Austen: if a book is well written, I always find it's too short. And of course, you can also say things that are too long are obviously not that well written. Here's some Jane Austen quotes. In fact, as Mr. Darcy said to her, you have bewitched me body and soul. And it's not what we say or think that defines us, it's what we do that defines us. And friendship is certainly the finest balm for the pangs of disappointed love. I would much rather have been merry than wise. When I fall in love, it'll be forever. We are all fools in love. Now, these quotes have got all places in Jane Austen's books. Sense and Sensibility is one of her great classics. Pride and Prejudice is probably her most successful of all. I think Pride and Prejudice was published after she died, though. And there have been quite a few modern adaptations. Emma is more of a comedy. Northanger Abbey was the first book Jane Austen wrote, actually, interestingly. Persuasion, another, and this is one of the good films made, Emma Thompson on Sense and Sensibility. The Emma film is also a pretty good expose of the heart of what you're saying. There have been some good films made. There's also a surprising amount of adaptations in Asia. Asia has a real love affair with Jane Austen. There's many Indian and Chinese films coming out on her books because they obviously really like, is it Bollywood, coming out of Bollywood from India. They've done a lot of Jane Austen novels. Now, just showing how the picture of the characters have evolved. From the left, you can see the traditional characters of Elizabeth Bennet, Mr. Darcy, Mr. Bingley there, and Lydia. Now, you can see progressively how the films have changed the look of these characters from the more historically contemporary, authentic to more modern kind of interpretation. You can see the men, the Mr. Darcys are changing dramatically, and also what they think Lydia or Janet looked like, and just, goodness me, I'm not impressed with the ones on the far right, which is where they're taking these characters. Just show how personnel is policy, and who you choose to play a certain role can really be keen. But the BBC has a good collection of Jane Austen novels turned into movies, which is a good introduction for those who are wanting to get into the books. This is the Steventon parsonage, because Jane Austen's father was a pastor, in fact, of 2 congregations, and she grew up in this manse, which was also the local schoolhouse. And this is their church, not that far away. This is the Jane Austen Museum that you can visit in England today, the house she lived in the last years of her life, where she wrote a lot of her books, and there's a lot of Jane Austen paraphernalia and mementos there. Jane Austen's been honoured in stamp series in Britain, and her father was Reverend George Austen, her mother Cassandra Lee, and now Jane was one of only 2 girls in a family of boys. Her other sister was also called Cassandra, after mom. So she is the 7th born, and she had 5 brothers. Actually 6 brothers, but 1 died young. And Jane Austen's family tree, you might be interested to know that Kate Middleton, who's destined to be the next Queen of England, is related to Jane Austen, which is quite intriguing. Just shows Jane Austen is in the line of nobility. The Victorian reaction to the excesses of Romanticism is also seen in the writings of Alfred Tennyson and Robert Browning and Matthew Arnold, George Meredith and Gerhard Hopkins, the Bronte sisters, George Eliot and Charles Dickens. Charles Dickens was a crusading social reformer. He reformed against the debtor's prison. If you got into debt, you went to prison. The workhouse, for especially the poor, and other abuses in Victorian society. However, as an astute observer of human nature, Charles Dickens exposes the faults typical of liberal thinking as well. He criticized the status quo, yes, but he also criticized a lot of the liberal alternatives they were offering too. And he produced fascinating books. Now, the big difference between Jane Austen and Charles Dickens is this. Jane Austen was always set in the countryside, and they occasionally visit the city, whereas Charles Dickens' novels are all set in the city, always in the city. And you can also see how the relationships are key to Jane Austen, but Charles Dickens is more concerned for causes, in a sense. He is a social crusader. His first book was Oliver Twist. The first thing to know about Charles Dickens is he was a court reporter. And so he was exposed to crime, and he was a journalist who started to write his novels as series in newspapers. So you'd read the first chapter of Oliver Twist in this series, and you'd have to wait for next week for the next chapter and so on. And so he produces books in series, and that's why Charles Dickens' books are great for film series, because he's always got a cliffhanger. He ends each chapter with, what's happening next? Where's the next edition? Bring the next one in quickly. So he's a journalist, and he writes very well as a journalist. And he introduced us to some of the most unforgettable characters in English literature. Now, Charles Dickens' monumentally important A Tale of Two Cities is about the French Revolution. He not only exposes the decadence of pre-revolution France and the monarchy, but he did such a devastatingly effective expose of the revolutionary ideology on the 200th anniversary of the French Revolution. The Prime Minister of England, Margaret Thatcher, presented French President Francois Mitterrand with a copy of Charles Dickens' A Tale of Two Cities, and she said, read this book and see why the French Revolution was completely unnecessary. And Margaret Thatcher really had a great sense of the historic. And when somebody asked her opinion of the French Revolution, she said, well, it resulted in a lot of headless corpses and a tyrant. So she was not impressed that they were celebrating the French Revolution on the 2nd century anniversary. Well, Charles Dickens' A Tale of Two Cities compares Paris and London. Paris, which is the result of Rousseau and Voltaire's philosophies and secular humanism, and London, which had the effects of the great evangelical awakening under Wesley and Whitefield. And so Christian London and secular humanist revolutionary Paris, that's a tale of two cities. Charles's novels illustrate the unintended consequences of liberal actions. Every set of choices sets in motion a complex chain of events that no one could have foreseen, let alone control. Good and evil deeds have very long shadows. The ultimate effects of our actions are determined more by the intrinsic character of our acts themselves than by our motivation at the time. It is, there are things that seem right unto man, but the end thereof is death. Deeds of greed and cruelty have devastating consequences. The end never justifies the means. It is never right to do evil so that good might come of it. In his Hard Times novel, Dickens not only depicts the conditions of factory workers, but he exposed the destructiveness of the radical modern experiments in education as well. In Dickens's Bleak House, you meet the liberal 101 classic, Mrs. Jellyby, who loves the Africans so much she neglects her own family, she persecutes her own children in pursuit of her high compassion ideals for strangers. Her children become casualties of the revolutionary era, in which large projects for the betterment of the human race crowd out the traditional family responsibilities and absolute moral standards. Her children say, I wish we could be black, then maybe our mother would love us. And they neglect it because she cares about strangers in Africa, but she doesn't care about her own children in her own home. Bleak House is another important novel that's often neglected. David Copperfield is sometimes seen as autobiographical. Charles Dickens never spoke about his traumatic childhood and his father in debtor's prison and him working in a shoe blacking factory and the abuse he suffered as a child. But it comes out in David Copperfield, the character that many people see as autobiographical. And only when Charles Dickens' biography came out years after his death did we start to learn about how he knew so well these conditions of the poor in the workhouses and in the debtors' prisons, because he had been there himself. Little Dorrit is an absolute gem, often overlooked, but a great book of, and this really exposes the bureaucracy of governments as well. Bleak House includes arguably the first case of a detective novel in English literature. There's a whole Charles Dickens collection by BBC, some of which are actually quite good. Evelyn Waugh points out that art, the only real aim of which is to annoy and upset its audience, is not really art at all. People of minimal skills and giftings, putting some rotting piece of meat or a bunch of broken things or throwing paint randomly against a canvas, that is not art. And for people to try and palm that off as art is pathetic. Waugh observes that without the Christian religion, human beings are disgustingly selfish and shallow. The loss of Christian faith means death for Western civilization. This may explain why so many politically correct English professors today have actually stopped teaching English literature. There are those who are able to see beyond the shadows and the lies of their culture. They will never be understood, let alone believed, by the masses. Plato said that about 2,400 years ago. It's still true today. Philippians 4 verse 8 gives us the standard by which we should judge all literature and art. Finally, brethren, whatever things are true, whatever things are noble, whatever things are just, whatever things are pure, whatever things are lovely, whatever things are of good report, if there's any virtue, if there's anything praiseworthy, meditate on these things. This is the standard. Excellence, virtue, things that are true and pure. By this standard, most of Hollywood's got to be rejected as substandard and unacceptable. Now, we've got downstairs in our Christian Liberty books a whole lot of books on literature of England and a range of exploring Christian literature. These are setwork books that are used for homeschooling often, studying Christian literature, enjoying Christian literature. And these give summaries of different key stories, fundamentals of Christian literature for Christian schools, excursions in literature. And we've used all of these books in our homeschooling in our family as well. Explorations in literature, Introduction to English Literature, and Pilgrim's Progress, of course, is one of the great books, one of the most innovative books. And it was so innovative, it has inspired countless copies and imitations. But I think to read the original Pilgrim's Progress is good, although we've got it in modern English as well. And by the way, books like these, if you say, I have trouble covering them all, one thing you can do is there's a lot of these books available as audio, and they're free. They are easily available. You can get a lot of them even on YouTube. It might be 8 hours, some of these, but if you do a lot of driving or while you're doing ironing, cleaning, fixing, rearranging, organizing books on the shelves, this is a good time that one can listen to A Tale of Two Cities or any of these great books, even some of Livingston's books, Calvin's books. There's a lot of great classics that you can get on audio. Now, there are films to introduce one to some of them, Great Expectations and so on, but the important thing is to be open to getting into these books and making time for them. I think like our schooling, we had books like 1984 and George Orwell's Animal Farm as set books, along with Romeo and Juliet and Hamlet, Macbeth. Those were some set book books. And Pride and Prejudice. These were set book books in school in Rhodesia that we had to go through as part of our English class. Fight evil, read books. Reading is an act of resistance in a landscape of distraction. Turn our back to the TV and get into the book and said, when I went to Belfast, Northern Ireland, I was interested to see a memorial to C.S. Lewis in Belfast, which is his hometown, by the way. Outside the library is a cupboard and a chair, and, think of the silver chair maybe, and the cupboard, and this is of C.S. Lewis and a cupboard. Born 1898, reborn 1931. How often do you see a memorial which says the date of the person's being born again? And my wife Laura and I went along to the inn where C.S. Lewis used to sit with Tolkien, and they used to discuss their novels, the Inklings they called it in Oxford, and they've got a lion set up there, and they've got a metal example of one of the writings of C.S. Lewis, sitting in this booth where he'd regularly meet with his friends on Friday, and they often scribbled out the ideas that became the Chronicles of Narnia and the Hobbit and all of the other great books produced by Tolkien and by C.S. Lewis. So as my children were growing up, every night was reading time, and our cat would often join us. Tanya was very devout, didn't miss any reading times. And I think it's so important. My oldest daughter, Andrea, she said, these are the happiest memories of reading time with Dad. And she ended up being an English literature major at university, in a good university though. And I remember my wife coming in when Andrea was 12 years old and saying, you've got to discipline Andrea. She's reading Shakespeare under the blankets off the lights out with a torch. So I went to Andrea and said, do you need more batteries? Do you need a better torch? And, well done, outstanding. I mean, how can you get angry with your daughter for reading Shakespeare under the covers at age 12? It's like, outstanding, excellent. I've written a whole bunch of books, some of which were inspired by what awful history books we've got in many English literature, many Christian curriculums. A lot of homeschooling books on history are pathetic. I get Becker books and so on. I think they're just pagan history with a few scripture verses added. They have the same selection of events and characters as the pagan history books, and there's nothing particularly different between an average Christian school history book and a pagan history book. So that led me to write books like Victorious Christians Who Changed the World, sketches on South African history, Great Century Reformation, Great Century Missions, and so on. Because I was very unhappy with what I saw in a lot of the Christian textbooks. My oldest daughter never had a problem with Dad correcting things with my black pen, changing things in the textbook. But my second daughter, Daniela, got horrified. Dad, how can the textbook be wrong? I said, well, it is wrong. And, well, how do you know you're right? Which is a good question. Well, I grew up in Rhodesia, I said. I knew Ian Smith. I know General Constant Villian. I met P.W. Botha. I know these people, and Ian Paisley in Northern Ireland. And I've climbed Mount Majuba. So I've been to Ulundi. I know these places. And so I can write about things that I know about and correct things that I know is wrong. But the people who write school textbooks, in many cases, are committees chosen by governments with a political agenda. And, we've got to be more critical. So we've got a lot of these history books downstairs. We've got many historical articles on our Reformation SA.org website. And there's some good films in our library of some of these great classic books like Henry V. By the way, the top 10 read books in the world. The Bible's, of course, top of them all. Notice Gone with the Wind's quite high. By the way, I would say the Diary of Anne Frank doesn't deserve to be there. You know that Diary of Anne Frank, a book was written in ballpoint pen, and ballpoint pens were not invented until after the war. And the father, Otto Frank, or the father, Anne Frank, actually lost a court case in New York for plagiarism, that he had stolen someone else's fictional novel and passed it off as his daughter's diaries, and he had to pay, and he did pay, something like $50,000 for stealing the copyright and plagiarism. So the Diary of Anne Frank is a fraud, just for those who are interested in knowing. The Lord of the Rings is obviously quite a powerful book. I don't know why the Da Vinci Code's here, that's a lot of rubbish. And here they've got other books to look at. I think Harry Potter is garbage. That's just witchcraft repackaged. Why anyone would waste their time reading Harry Potter? Honestly, I think you'd be better off sitting at home and drinking dish cleaning liquid or rat poison. Why would one want to read garbage like that? When Harry Potter came out, somebody said Harry Potter's outselling the Bible. Not in its best year. Never. Under no circumstances. You know, are they crazy? Not at all. So that's the kind of lies you can get. And here we've got someone else's list of the best-selling books of all time. Interesting that this includes The Hobbit here. She, an adventure, a history of adventure. She is one of Sir Rider Haggard's books. He's the one who did the King Solomon's Mines, which was like must-reading when I grew up for any young boy. She, actually, the correct subtitle is She Who Must Be Obeyed. I don't know where A History of Adventure came in, but they've added another subtitle there. But the world's #1 best-selling book has always been the Bible, and it always will be.